October 25th, 1944, 0645 hours. Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. The horizon erupts in waterspouts. Massive geysers of seawater tower higher than the masts of the USS White Plains as 18-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small car, slam into the ocean mere yards from her hull. On the escort carrier's bridge, signalman Third Class Elbert Gentry watches in disbelief as pagoda-shaped superstructures emerge from the morning haze. Those aren't American ships. They're Japanese battleships. The largest battleship ever built, Yamato, has just opened fire with guns that can hurl a shell 26 miles. Behind her, the battleship Nagato, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers bear down on a handful of American escort carriers and their tiny escorts. The Americans have nothing bigger than a 5-inch gun. The Yamato alone displaces more tonnage than the entire American task force combined. Commander Ernest Evans aboard the destroyer USS Johnston doesn't hesitate. He orders flank speed directly toward the enemy fleet. His crew thinks he's lost his mind. They're probably right. This is Taffy. 3 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, glorified cargo ships and tin cans, facing the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were never meant to fight capital ships. Their carriers were converted merchant vessels, combustible, vulnerable, expendable, as their crews darkly joked about their CVE designation. Their largest guns couldn't even dent the armor belt of a battleship at point-blank range. Yet here they are, the only thing standing between Admiral Kurita's center force and the American invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers and mountains of supplies sit virtually defenseless. If Kurita breaks through, he could single-handedly turn the tide of the Philippine campaign, maybe even the Pacific War itself. The men of Taffy 3 know the math. They know their 5-inch shells will bounce off battleship armor like tennis balls off concrete. They know their torpedo bombers are loaded with depth charges for submarine patrol, not armor-piercing bombs. They know their destroyers were built to hunt submarines, not duel with heavy cruisers. But mathematics and logic fled the moment those pagoda masts appeared on the horizon. Admiral Clifton, Ziggy Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the bridge of USS Fanshawe Bay, watches colored splashes bracket his ships. The Japanese are using dye markers to track their shooting, purple for Yamato, pink for Nagato, yellow and red for the cruisers. It's almost beautiful, this rainbow of death painting the morning sea. He orders his carriers to make smoke, to launch everything that can fly, and then he does something that will echo through naval history. He orders his escorts to attack. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 7,000 tons of American steel, turned to charge 350,000 tons of Japanese battleships and cruisers. The morning sun catches their bow waves as they accelerate to flank speed, white foam streaming from their stems like cavalry pennants. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from the Japanese bridges. Surely these Americans must have something up their sleeve. Some trap. Some hidden fleet waiting over the horizon. They don't. It's just 7 small ships buying time with the only currency they have themselves. Commander Ernest Evans was half Cherokee, half Welsh, and entirely warrior. At Annapolis, they'd called him the Chief. His crew on the Johnston simply called him Fearless. As his destroyer charged toward ships that outweighed her by factors of 10, Evans grabbed the ship's intercom. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody moved. The Johnston was already wounded. Shrapnel from near misses had peppered her superstructure, and the concussion from the massive shells had knocked out electrical systems. But Evans ordered smoke, and the destroyer disappeared into her own chemical cloud, racing through the rainbow-colored splashes at 35 knots. Through the smoke, glimpses of the enemy, the knife-edge bow of a heavy cruiser, the towering pagoda of a battleship, gun flashes lighting up the haze like lightning. Meanwhile, above this naval knife fight, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch, O'Hare not the famous ace, but another O'Hare, entirely leads his squadron of FM-2 Wildcats off the deck of USS Callanan Bay. His pilots are armed for anti-submarine patrol, depth charges, tiny 100-pound bombs, and machine guns. Against battleships, they might as well be throwing stones. But O'Hare doesn't hesitate. "We'll make dry runs when we're out of ammo," he tells his pilots. "We'll keep their heads down." You have to understand the sheer audacity of what happens next. These Wildcat pilots, knowing their weapons are useless against armored warships, dive anyway. They drop depth charges that explode harmlessly against steel, designed to withstand 16-inch shells. When they run out of bombs, they make strafing runs with 50 caliber machine guns, bullets that literally bounce off the armor like rain. When they run out of bullets, they keep diving, empty, unarmed, just to force the Japanese gunners to duck, to split their attention, to buy seconds of time. One pilot, out of ammunition, flies so close to a Japanese cruiser that he can see the faces of the anti-aircraft gunners. He pulls up at the last second, his prop wash actually blowing off the caps of Japanese sailors on deck. Another pilot reports, "I'm out of ammo, but I'm not out of guts." Back on the surface, the Johnston bursts from her smokescreen, less than 10,000 yards from the heavy cruiser Kumano. At this range, even the Johnston's 5-inch guns can hurt. Evans orders rapid fire, and the destroyer's guns bark in desperate rhythm. Incredibly, impossibly, they score hits on Kumano's superstructure, starting fires. Then the destroyer's torpedo officer gets the range. 10 fish in the water. The torpedoes streak toward Kumano. The Japanese cruiser, 15 times the Johnston's displacement, actually turns away. She's forced to evade, breaking formation. One torpedo hits, blowing off her bow. The heavy cruiser Kumano, pride of the Imperial Navy, falls out of line, crippled by a ship that could fit on her deck. But physics and firepower can only be denied for so long. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo find Johnston simultaneously. The destroyer staggers like a boxer taking a haymaker. The shells tear through her like she's made of paper, which, compared to battleship armor, she essentially is. One shell destroys the after engine room, cutting her speed in half. Another wrecks the bridge, sending shrapnel tearing through everything and everyone in its path. Commander Evans loses 2 fingers on his left hand. Shrapnel tears into his neck, his chest, his legs. His shirt is literally blown off his body. Blood streams down his face from head wounds. A pharmacist's mate tries to pull him below for treatment. Evans refuses. He tears his shirt into strips, wraps his mangled hand, and continues commanding his ship from the exposed deck, shouting orders through the smoke and chaos. He's not unique in his defiance. On every American ship, the same drama plays out in different keys. On the destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, as she'll be known, her crew loads shells by hand when the power hoists fail, forming human chains and temperatures that reach 130 degrees in the gun mounts. They fire so rapidly, so continuously, that the paint burns off the gun barrels. The barrels themselves begin to glow cherry red, then white hot, warping from the heat. By 0730 hours, the battle has become a melee. Military historians would later call it the most chaotic naval engagement of World War II. Japanese battleships, expecting to fight a traditional line battle, find themselves in a knife fight. American destroyers weave between salvos from ships that could sink them with a single hit. Escort carriers, never designed for surface combat, fire their single 5-inch stern guns at heavy cruisers while running for their lives. The destroyer, Hoel, already mortally wounded, continues firing even as she lists heavily to port. Over 40 hits have torn her apart. Her bridge is gone, her engine rooms are flooded, her guns are being aimed by hand. But she keeps shooting. Her gunners, working in local control after all communication is cut, simply fire at whatever Japanese ship they can see. When Hoel finally rolls over and sinks, she's still shooting. Gunners mate third-class Paul Carr, aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, becomes a legend in the making. When a direct hit destroys his gun mount, Carr is found torn nearly in half, still holding a 54-pound shell, trying to load it into a gun that no longer exists. He dies begging his shipmates to keep firing. They do. The escort carrier Gambier Bay takes the concentrated fire of the heavy cruiser Chikuma. These escort carriers were built on merchant hulls with half-inch steel plates for armor. Chikuma's 8-inch shells punch through Gambier Bay like she's made of cardboard. But even as she's being systematically destroyed, Gambier Bay's single-stern gun keeps firing. Her pilots, with nowhere to land, continue their empty-handed attacks until they run out of fuel and have to ditch in the sea. You can almost feel the confusion spreading through Admiral Kurita's fleet. These Americans aren't acting like a defeated force. They're attacking with a fury that defies reason. Every Japanese captain has the same thought. What do the Americans know that we don't? Where is their real fleet? This has to be a trap. Through his binoculars, Kurita watches an American destroyer, the Johnston. Though he doesn't know her name, charge directly at the heavy cruiser Tone. The destroyer is already crippled, down to one engine, her bridge destroyed, steering manually from the fantail. She's been hit by dozens of shells. Smoke pours from fires throughout her hull. She can barely make 17 knots. Yet she attacks. The Johnston closes to point-blank range with Tone, and they duel like Age of Sail frigates. 5-inch against 8-inch guns at ranges where you can see your enemy's faces. The destroyer scores 40 hits on Tone's superstructure before Japanese shells finally find her engine room. Dead in the water, the Johnston is surrounded by enemy cruisers and destroyers. They pound her with shell fire at ranges of less than 1,000 yards. Even then, even at the end, the Johnston's gunners engage a Japanese destroyer preparing to torpedo the escort carrier Gambier Bay. With no power, no communication, no hope, they manually crank their guns around and open fire. They drive off the destroyer. Only then, only after this final act of defiance, does Commander Evans give the order to abandon ship. As the crew goes over the side, Japanese destroyer captains order their men to stand at attention and salute. They are saluting the Johnston as she goes down. They are saluting Evans, last seen helping wounded sailors over the side, who goes down with his ship and is never seen again. Admiral Kurita stares at the tactical plot aboard his flagship Yamato. For over 2 hours, his fleet has been fighting what he believes must be American fleet carriers and cruisers. His communications are shattered, his formations are scattered, his cruisers are reporting torpedo attacks from every direction. The Americans have fought with a ferocity that suggests they're protecting something vital. Through the smoke and chaos, Kurita tries to make sense of the battle. The heavy cruiser Kumano is crippled, falling behind. The Chikuma is taking heavy damage. 3 of his heavy cruisers have been forced to evade torpedo attacks, breaking his battle line. American aircraft over 400 sorties from Taffy 3's escort carriers swarm his ships continuously. Even when they have no bombs, no bullets, they dive anyway, forcing his ships to maneuver, spoiling their aim. What Kurita doesn't know, what he can't believe, is that he's fighting ships a fraction of his fleet's size. Those fleet carriers are converted merchant ships. Those cruisers are destroyers and destroyer escorts. The entire American force he's been battling has less firepower than one of his battleships. But the Americans have fought with such desperate fury, such suicidal aggression, that Kurita assumes he must be facing the main American fleet. At 0911 hours, with victory literally within sight, The remaining escort carriers are almost within range of his battleship's secondary batteries. Kurita makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He orders his fleet to turn north, to disengage, to retreat. On the bridge of USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague watches in disbelief as the pagoda masts turn away. His communications officer hands him a message. The enemy is retiring. Sprague thinks it's a mistake. Verify that report, he orders. But it's true. The greatest concentration of Japanese surface firepower in the entire war is running from 6 jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Well, what's left of them? The destroyer Johnston is gone. The destroyer Hull is gone. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts is gone. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, the only American carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire, is going down. Over 1,500 American sailors are dead or dying in the water. The surviving ships are shot full of holes, leaking oil, carrying dead and wounded in every compartment. But they won. David beat Goliath. The thin-skinned escorts of Taffy III turned back the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy through nothing but raw courage and the willingness to sacrifice everything. They saved the invasion fleet. They saved potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. They changed the course of the war in the Pacific. As the Japanese fleet disappears over the horizon, the surviving American sailors tend to their wounded, fight their fires, and search for survivors in the oil-slicked water. Many of the men in the water will spend 50 hours floating in shark-infested seas before rescue arrives. They will watch their wounded shipmates slip beneath the waves. They will fight off shark attacks with nothing but their fists and their life jackets. But even in the water, even dying, they know what they've accomplished. Seaman First Class Lloyd Gurnett, floating in his life jacket, watching the Japanese fleet retreat, turns to another survivor and says, "I guess we showed them sons of bitches how." In the water where the Samuel B. Roberts went down, over 120 survivors cling to 3 life rafts and debris. The sun turns the oil-slicked sea into a mirror of fire. Their skin, coated in bunker oil, begins to blister and burn. Salt water in open wounds becomes a special kind of torture. And then come the sharks. Chief Torpedoman Vince Goodrich organizes the survivors into groups, keeping the wounded in the rafts, the strongest swimmers on the perimeter. When sharks approach, the men on the outside splash and shout, sometimes punching the predators on their snouts. One sailor, Seaman Second Class James Stevens, fights off a shark with his knife, stabbing it repeatedly until it retreats into the red-tinged water. They will do this for 2 days. For the men of the Johnston, the ordeal is worse. Commander Evans is gone, his body never recovered, his final moments known only to the sea. Of the 327 men aboard Johnston, only 141 survived the sinking. In the water, covered in oil, many wounded, they watch Japanese destroyers approach. They prepare for the machine gunning they expect. Instead, the Japanese sailors throw food and water canisters into the water. One Japanese officer stands at attention and salutes. Then they steam away. But dignity from the enemy doesn't stop exposure, dehydration, and sharks from taking their toll. By the time rescue arrives days later, only 141 of Johnston's crew remain alive. Many die just hours before help arrives, their bodies giving out after fighting to survive for so long. Lieutenant Robert Copeland, commanding officer of the Samuel B. Roberts, will later write, "To witness the conduct of the average American sailor, with an average American's background, facing death and horrible injury, is to realize an inherent quality of greatness in our people." The statistics tell one story. In 2.5 hours, Taffy III lost 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and an escort carrier. Over 1,500 American sailors died. But the statistics can't capture the whole truth. They can't capture gunner's mate Paul Carr trying to load a gun that no longer existed. They can't capture pilots making attack runs with empty guns. They can't capture Commander Evans, mangled and bleeding, refusing medical treatment to continue fighting. Admiral Kurita would spend the rest of his life defending his decision to retreat. In his war diary, he wrote that he faced carriers and cruisers. Even after the war, when shown the actual composition of Taffy 3, he refused to believe it. It was impossible, he said, for such small ships to fight so fiercely. There had to have been fleet carriers. There had to have been heavy cruisers. Otherwise, nothing made sense. But that was exactly the point. Nothing about the Battle off Samar made sense, except for one thing, the idea that some things are worth more than survival. The men of Taffy 3 understood that if they didn't stand and fight, regardless of the odds, the invasion fleet would be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would die. The liberation of the Philippines would fail. So they stood and fought, and died, and won. Section 6. The Reckoning. President Franklin Roosevelt would call it one of the most gallant engagements in United States naval history. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz would say, "In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours off Samar." But for the survivors, the accolades felt hollow against the memory of empty bunks and missing faces. On the escort carrier White Plains, which survived the battle, Seaman First Class John Mitchell wrote home, "Mom, I can't tell you where I am or what happened, but if you ever meet the family of anyone from the Johnston, the Hole, the Roberts, or the Gambier Bay, you tell them their boys were heroes. Every last one." Commander Ernest Evans would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor, one of only 2 Native Americans so honored in World War II. His citation reads, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty." But no citation can capture the image of Evans, his hand mangled, his body torn by shrapnel, standing on the fantail of his dying ship, shouting steering orders through the smoke. Paul Henry Carr, the gunner's mate who died trying to load a destroyed gun, would receive the Silver Star. Robert Copeland, of the Samuel B. Roberts, would receive the Navy Cross. The ships themselves would receive Presidential Unit citations. But medals are cold comfort to Gold Star families and empty places at dinner tables. The tactical impact was immediate and decisive. The Battle off Samar, combined with the other engagements of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, effectively ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers over the course of the 3-day battle. They would never again mount a major naval offensive, but the strategic impact went deeper. The kamikaze attacks that would characterize the final year of the Pacific War were born from the Japanese Navy's humiliation at Samar. If Americans would fight so fanatically with conventional weapons, the Japanese reasoning went, then Japan must be even more fanatical. The divine wind would have to blow. Yet for all the historical analysis, all the strategic implications, the Battle off Samar remains, at its core, a story about ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Farm boys from Iowa who charged battleships, mechanics from Detroit who kept guns firing as their ships sank beneath them, teachers and store clerks and factory workers who stood between the Imperial Japanese Navy and disaster and refused to move. Today, 13,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, the Johnston rests deeper than any other shipwreck ever discovered. Found in 2019, she sits upright on the ocean floor, her hull number 557 still visible on her bow. Her guns are still trained outboard, still ready to fight. She is, even in death, a warship on patrol. The Samuel B. Roberts lies nearby. Discovered in 2022, the deepest shipwreck ever found. Her torpedo tubes are still trained out, ready to fire. Her gun mounts, though empty now, still point toward the enemy. Like the Johnston, she rests in combat position, an eternal sentinel in the abyss. These ships are more than steel and rivets rusting in the deep. They are monuments to a simple truth, that ordinary people, faced with the impossible, can choose to be extraordinary. That courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That sometimes the smallest among us must stand against the mighty, not because victory is certain, but because standing is right. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, skipper of the Samuel B. Roberts, would later say, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." They did more than damage. They won. A handful of tin cans and jeep carriers turned back the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy through nothing but courage and the absolute conviction that some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win, even when you know you won't survive, even when the smart thing, the logical thing, the sane thing would be to run. They didn't run. In the pre-dawn darkness of every October 25th, the United States Navy holds a memorial service for the Battle off Samar. They read the names of the ships lost. They toll the bell for the sailors who died. And they remember that once, off a small island in the Philippines, David met Goliath, and David won. Not through superior firepower, not through brilliant tactics, but through the simple, immortal courage of sailors who looked at impossible odds and attacked anyway. The Japanese would call it the Battle of Bullheaded Determination. The Americans would call it the finest hour. History would call it a miracle. The men who fought it had a simpler name. They called it duty.